Mira opens her university portal and sees her sister's name where her own name should be. She didn't react with anger. She opened a new document, typed the date, and began a list. You're watching Historical Manhwa. The smell of old paper and ethanol is something most people find unpleasant. I found it clarifying. I had been working in the same research lab at Thornfield University for 4 years by the time any of this began. The lab was in the basement of the Biological Sciences wing, which meant no natural light, fluorescent tubes that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious thought, and a smell that was part chemical, part damp, part the specific staleness of knowledge being worked over until it gave up something useful. I loved it. I loved it the way you love a place that never pretends to be anything other than what it is. My name is Mira. I was 31 years old, a postdoctoral researcher specializing in environmental genomics, specifically the study of microbial adaptation in soil ecosystems subjected to industrial contamination. And I know that sentence loses most people. The short version is this. I was trying to understand what makes certain bacteria survive in conditions that should kill them, and why that survival mechanism could eventually help us remediate land that the chemical industry had spent decades poisoning. It was slow work. It was detail work. It was the kind of work that required you to be comfortable spending 6 months to confirm a result that a single bad lab practice could invalidate in an afternoon. I was comfortable with that. My sister Delphine was not. Delphine was 2 years younger than me. She had my mother's face and my father's instincts, which meant she was beautiful in a way that made people assume she was kind, and ambitious in a way that she had learned early to disguise as enthusiasm. She was also a researcher, environmental science, adjacent to my field. And she had joined Thornfield's department 18 months after I did, which had seemed, at the time, like coincidence layered over genuine interest. I understood later that it was neither. Our relationship had always existed in a particular register. Not hostile, not close. We occupied the same family, the same professional field, sometimes the same department seminars, with the practiced neutrality of two people who know each other too well to be strangers and not well enough to be allies. Our mother thought we were simply different personalities. She was right about that. She was wrong about what it meant. The grant I applied for was the Westmere Environmental Research Foundation Fellowship, $200,000 over 3 years. So awarded annually to a researcher working on projects with direct applications to environmental remediation. It was competitive. Only 8 were awarded nationally each year. I had spent the better part of 5 months constructing my application. I want to be specific about that construction because it matters. The application required a 30-page research proposal, a 3-year budget justification, preliminary data, 3 letters of recommendation, a diversity and impact statement, and evidence of institutional support. I wrote every word of the research proposal myself. The preliminary data came from 3 years of my own experimental work, sequencing results, soil chemistry analyses, comparison studies I had run twice to be certain the results held. The budget justification required me to cost out every reagent and every piece of equipment, every research assistant hour, every travel expense for the field collection work. It took me until 11 o'clock most nights. My boyfriend at the time, a pleasant, uncomplicated man named Marcus who was finishing a law degree across town, started commenting that I seemed to be at the lab more than I was at home. He wasn't wrong. He also wasn't the kind of person who understood why that was necessary, which is a different kind of problem and a different kind of story. I submitted the application on a Thursday evening in October. I remember the exact feeling of pressing the submit button. Not relief, but a kind of suspension. The way you feel when you have done everything you can and the outcome is no longer in your hands. The portal confirmed receipt. I printed the confirmation. And I saved a timestamped screenshot to a folder I kept in cloud storage labeled simply Westmere 2023. I was thorough about documentation by habit. That habit predated any suspicion. It was simply how I worked. If something was important enough to do, it was important enough to record properly. I went home that night and made pasta from a box and watched 2 episodes of a documentary series about deep-sea organisms. I slept better than I had in weeks. What I did not know on that Thursday evening in October was that Delphine had been reading my application. Not a draft. The final application. The submitted version. She had access to my shared university cloud storage because I had, 7 months earlier, added her as a collaborator on a folder containing some departmental meeting notes we were both supposed to have. But I had forgotten to remove her when the committee work ended. I had forgotten she was there at all. It was that simple. The entire catastrophe of the following year had that as its origin point. A cloud storage folder permission I had never thought to revoke. She did not copy my application. She rewrote it, or rather, she had it rewritten. Later, during the investigation, I would learn that she had enlisted a graduate student named Felix, who was finishing his dissertation under a faculty member in her wing and who wanted badly a letter of recommendation. She gave him her login access, my application documents, and a 2-day deadline. Felix rewrote the proposal in third person, changed the study species from bacteria to soil fungi, kept the structural framework and the logical progression of the research design. Almost changed the preliminary data citations to a subset of her own published work, and recast the environmental remediation angle into language about sustainable agricultural recovery. The proposal she submitted was not identical to mine. It was mine the way a translation is the original. The bones were the same, the logic was the same, the thinking, the actual intellectual architecture that had taken me 3 years of experimental work to build was the same. She submitted it 4 days before the application deadline, which meant she submitted it 5 days after I did. The Westmere Foundation reviewed applications over December and January. I was not anxious during that period. I felt I had done good work. I had competitive preliminary data. I had 3 strong letters, one from my primary supervisor, one from an external researcher at a different institution who knew my work well, and one from a collaborator on a previous paper. I thought my chances were reasonable. In February, I received an email from the Westmere Foundation's program officer. It thanked me for my application and informed me that my submission had not been selected for funding. I sat with that for a day. Rejection is part of this work. I had been rejected before and would be again. I wrote a polite reply asking if feedback on the application was available, which is the correct professional response. I allowed myself one evening of feeling deflated. Then I moved on. I did not know at that point that Delphine had been awarded the fellowship. Almost I found out the way everyone finds out about things in academia, through a departmental email that went to everyone in the college. The subject line was, "Congratulations to our Westmere recipients." There were 2 names listed from Thornfield, a 4th-year PhD student in marine biology, and Delphine. I read her name twice, not because I didn't understand it, because I needed a moment to locate where I was in the sequence of events. She had applied for the same fellowship. That was not, in itself, remarkable. We worked in adjacent fields. The fellowship covered both. She had applied and won. I had applied and lost. These were facts. But something ran cold through me. Sitting at my desk in the basement lab that Wednesday afternoon, reading her name in departmental congratulations. Not anger, not grief, a quiet, specific alertness. Oh, like a sound in the dark that you can't immediately name. I closed the email. I opened a new document. I typed the date at the top. And I began a list. I did not yet know what I was building. I only knew I had learned, over 4 years of research science, that the most dangerous moment in any investigation is the one where you let instinct outpace evidence. So I did not act on instinct. I documented it. Entry 1, date, time. Notification that Delphine was awarded Westmere Fellowship. Fellowship I applied for. Our fields adjacent. Preliminary instinct. Review application overlap. I saved the document. I named it the way I named all my working logs. The date, then a short descriptor. February 2024, _Westmere notes. Then I went back to my bacteria. It took me 3 days to get hold of a copy of Delphine's funded proposal. Funded proposals are not automatically public, but the Westmere Foundation, like many private research funders, posted abstracts and brief summaries of all funded work on their website as part of their transparency commitments to donors. I found the summary for her award that Friday evening. I read it once, quickly. Then I sat back from my computer and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The summary described a 3-year study of fungal adaptation mechanisms in industrially contaminated soils, with a focus on developing bioremediation applications. The research design as described involved a two-phase experimental structure, beginning with genomic characterization and followed by controlled environmental application studies. The summary of her project was the summary of my project. I changed at the level of the organism, bacteria to fungi, but structurally, logically, architecturally identical. I did not feel rage. I want to be precise about that because it matters to what came next. What I felt was something colder than rage. It was the feeling of a hypothesis confirmed that you had been hoping to disprove. I typed a second entry in my log document. Then I opened a new folder in my cloud storage, named it Westmere_documentation, and I began. The first thing I did was retrieve every draft of my application. I had 12 saved drafts, each time stamped by the cloud storage system, the earliest dating to the previous June, when I had started outlining. I noted the dates, I noted the file sizes, which changed incrementally across drafts in the pattern of genuine iterative writing. Yes, I pulled the final submission confirmation email from my inbox, timestamped October 19th, and saved a screenshot to the documentation folder. The second thing I did was request, through the Westmere Foundation's formal records process, a copy of my own submitted application for my personal records. This is a standard right under most grant foundation policies. They were required to provide it within 30 days. I noted the date of my request and saved a copy of the request email. The third thing I did was pull the cloud storage access log for the folder I shared with Delphine. Every cloud storage system maintains access logs, records of when files were viewed, downloaded, or copied, tagged with the user account that performed the action. I had never thought to look at these logs before. I looked now. Delphine's account had accessed the folder containing my grant application draft 7 times between June and October of the previous year. The most recent access, 3 days before my final submission date, showed a download event. She had downloaded my final draft application. I sat with that for a while. Then I added the access log to my documentation folder, noted the specific timestamps, and cross-referenced them against my own draft history to confirm that the drafts she had accessed were the substantive ones, not early outlines, but the developed, detailed working versions. The version she had downloaded 3 days before I submitted was the version that was, to within a few minor edits, my final application. At entry 3 in my working log, Cloud Storage Access Log shows D account, downloading my final draft application October 16th. My submission date October 19th. Her submission deadline same as mine, October 21st. She submitted, I would later confirm, October 17th. I did the math on that timeline twice because it felt too convenient to trust. She had downloaded my work on the 16th. She had submitted her application on the 17th. That was 1 day. 1 day to take my 3 years of thinking and get it converted into a submission under her name. I put my head in my hands and I stayed that way for a moment. Not in grief, not in shock. In the particular stillness of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of a problem they are going to have to solve carefully. Then I lifted my head and went back to building the case. The question I was working around, the central problem, was this. Cloud storage access logs showed she had accessed my work. They did not, by themselves, prove she had used it. Similarity between 2 research proposals in the same field by 2 researchers at the same institution who had talked about their work at family dinners and departmental seminars for a year and a half was not by itself proof of theft. A good lawyer, or a good institutional lawyer, would argue independent development, would argue convergent thinking, would argue that adjacent fields by their nature produce adjacent proposals. I needed more than access logs. I needed to demonstrate with specificity that the intellectual architecture of her proposal could not have developed independently of mine. And this is where my work as a researcher helped me in a way I had not anticipated. Evidence construction in research science is not fundamentally different from evidence construction in an investigation. You form a hypothesis. You identify what would disprove it. You look for what you cannot explain any other way. I spent the next 2 weeks doing a structural analysis of the 2 proposals side by side. I did not have her full proposal. I had the public summary, but the summary was detailed enough to work with. I made a table. On the left, excerpts from my proposal. On the right, corresponding elements from her summary. I used yellow and green highlighting, yellow for structural parallels, green for specific phrasings that appeared in both despite the organism change. There were 43 yellow entries. There were 11 green ones. The green ones were what I focused on. Specific phrasing, not common field terminology, not standard grant language, but turns of phrase I had used in my proposal that appeared, slightly modified, in hers. A 3-part articulation of research rationale that I had developed over multiple drafts because I had been unhappy with the standard way researchers stated it. A particular framing of the remediation application potential that was specific to the way I thought about the work, not the way the field generally discussed it. Those phrasings could not be independently developed. They were mine. They were in her proposal because she had read my proposal. I documented all 43 entries. I documented the 11 green entries with a separate notation. I saved everything. I also, during this period, did something more delicate. I talked to Felix. Felix Harmon was the graduate student Delphine had used, though I did not know that yet. I knew him only slightly. We had overlapped at a couple of departmental events. He was a serious, somewhat anxious young man who was clearly stressed about his dissertation timeline. I had no reason to suspect him of anything, but I had noticed in the preceding weeks that he had begun avoiding eye contact with me in the hallways. Small thing, the kind of small thing you would not notice unless you were already paying attention. I did not confront him. I did not ask him anything directly. I simply made a note of the behavior in my log and continued building the structural analysis. What I was constructing over those weeks, ours was a documented record that would hold up to scrutiny from people who were professionally trained to find the gaps in records. The Office of Research Integrity at Thornfield University, which is the body responsible for investigating research misconduct, operated under formal federal and institutional guidelines. A complaint without a documented evidentiary basis would be investigated, yes, but slowly, skeptically, and with enormous deference to the accused. A complaint backed by time-stamped documentary evidence, structural analysis, and a clear, logical argument would require them to take it seriously. I intended to give them the second kind. While I was building this, the rest of my life continued in its ordinary way. I went to the lab, I ran my experiments, till I wrote up a paper on preliminary findings that I submitted to a mid-tier journal in March. I attended departmental seminars, including one in which Delphine gave a brief presentation on her research directions for the coming year, the research that my grant was now funding. And I sat 4 rows back and watched her speak and felt nothing particular except a precise, evaluative attention. She was good. That was the hardest part to hold. She was a competent researcher in her own right, and the way she talked about the work was fluent and confident. She had lived with these ideas long enough, whether she had originated them or not, that they now sounded like hers. I took notes on specific statements she made that would later be useful to compare against her proposal and against my original work. Marcus and I had, by this point, ended things. Not because of any of this. He didn't know any of it. It was quieter than that. He had finished his law degree and accepted a position in a firm in another city, and we had both done the calculation that the distance made less sense than the separation, and so we had parted with mutual politeness and no lasting damage. I tell you this only because it is part of the texture of that period. I was alone with this investigation in a way that made it both harder and, I think, more focused. I was not confiding in anyone. I had thought carefully about whether to tell my supervisor, Dr. Gideon Ashby, who had been my primary mentor at Thornfield for 4 years, and who was, by every measure, someone I trusted. I decided to wait until I had a complete documented file before approaching him. I guess my reasoning was practical. If I told him early and he went to the department with incomplete information, it would give Delphine warning. It would give her time to construct a counter-narrative. Investigations that are telegraphed before they are filed often fail. I wanted to file something that was already too specific to explain away. So I said nothing to Gideon. I said nothing to anyone. I went to the lab, I ran my experiments, I ate lunch alone at my desk most days, and every evening I spent an hour on the documentation folder. By mid-April, the file was substantial. It contained my 12 drafts with timestamps, my submission confirmation email, the cloud storage access log with Delphine's download events noted and time-stamped, the structural analysis comparing my proposal to her public summary, but with 43 parallel elements cataloged and 11 shared phrasings identified. A timeline document showing the sequence of events from my first draft to her submission date. A brief literature review demonstrating that the shared phrasings were not standard field terminology, that they were constructions specific to my drafts, and a cover document, which I had written in the precise, technical language of a formal research integrity complaint describing the nature of the alleged misconduct, the specific evidence I was providing, and the specific provisions of Thornfield's research integrity policy that I believed had been violated. I had read the research integrity policy 3 times by that point. I had also read the federal guidelines it was derived from, and a document called the Research Misconduct Policy Guidelines, issued by the Office of Research Integrity at the Department of Health and Human Services. I was not a lawyer, but I understood policy documents. I understood how to read them for what they actually required versus what they implied, and I understood which provisions were the operative ones. The provision I was building to was this: fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, reviewing, or reporting research. Plagiarism was defined in the policy as appropriating another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. The definition did not require word-for-word copying. It required appropriation of ideas, processes, or results. And when I had 43 entries in my structural analysis showing the appropriation of ideas and processes, I had 11 entries showing the appropriation of words. In late April, I scheduled a meeting with Gideon. I went to his office on a Thursday morning. His office was on the 3rd floor of the same building as my lab, which meant walking up 3 flights of stairs and into a room that always smelled of coffee and the particular slightly dusty warmth of too many books. He had supervised me for 4 years. He was 53, methodical, not particularly warm in a social sense, but deeply fair in a professional one. When he looked at you across his desk, you felt that he was actually processing what you said. I put my documentation file on his desk. Not the full digital version, a printed summary, 15 pages, with the key evidence highlighted and the timeline clearly laid out. I explained what I had found. I explained how I had found it. I explained what I was going to do next. He read the summary in silence. This took about 12 minutes. I sat across from him and looked at the window behind his head, which faced a courtyard where some indeterminate spring plant was flowering. When he finished, he looked at me. "Have you been carrying this since February?" he said. "Since the 3rd week of February, yes. Alone. I needed to have the evidence documented before I brought it to anyone. I was concerned about telegraphing the investigation before it was formally filed." He was quiet for a moment. "That was the correct decision," he said. Then, "I should have caught this myself. I reviewed her application at her request, and as I should have caught the structural similarities. The full proposals aren't public. You had no reason to compare them. Still," he closed the printed summary. "What do you need from me?" "I need a letter to accompany the complaint, confirming the timeline of my research development, when I came to you with the preliminary findings, when we discussed the remediation application angle, when I shared the research design framework, things that are in your email history and meeting notes." He nodded. "I'll write it today. And I need you to not tell anyone before I file. Not the department chair, not anyone." He held my gaze for a moment. "You don't trust the department." "I trust that information tends to travel. I want to file on my own terms." "All right," he said. I filed the complaint the following Monday. The Office of Research Integrity at Thornfield was housed in a suite of offices in the administration building, which was a different building from the science wings, cleaner and quieter, with carpeted hallways and the particular institutional smell of filtered air and fresh coffee from the staff kitchen. I had submitted the complaint electronically the night before. The policy allowed for digital submission, but I went in person the following morning to deliver a physical copy of the documentation file and to speak briefly with the intake officer. The intake officer was a woman named Margaret Ellsworth, who had the particular manner of someone who had processed many documents in a professional life and had reached a state of complete informational neutrality. She checked my submission against her intake checklist with methodical efficiency. She asked me two clarifying questions: whether I was the sole author of the proposal in question, and whether I had any reason to believe the respondent, the formal term for the person being investigated, was aware of this complaint. I answered yes to the first and no to the second. She gave me a case reference number. She told me the preliminary inquiry would begin within 30 calendar days. I walked out of the administration building into April sunlight. The trees along the main path had leafed out fully, and the light through them was that very specific shade of spring green that appears for about 2 weeks a year. I stood there for a moment in the warmth, and then I walked back to my lab and started my afternoon data run. The 30 days of preliminary inquiry passed. I received a notification in late May that the complaint had cleared preliminary review and was being advanced to formal investigation. This was the procedural outcome I had expected. The evidence file was too specific and too well documented to be dismissed at the preliminary stage, but I felt something release in my chest when I read it nonetheless. What I had not anticipated was what happened in the middle of May, in the weeks between filing and the advancement notification. Delphine came to my apartment. She arrived on a Saturday evening unannounced. I heard the buzzer and looked at the intercom screen and saw her face. I let her in because turning her away would have accomplished nothing and would have appeared, later, as the kind of hostile action that complicates an investigation record. I answered the door in the clothes I had been wearing all day, jeans and a gray sweatshirt, and I did not offer her anything to drink, and I did not sit down. She stood in my living room. She had dressed with a kind of studied casualness, clothes that were casual but had clearly been chosen. Her hair was done. She was performing a version of herself that she wanted me to read as unthreatened and reasonable. "I know you filed something," she said. I looked at her. "Did you?" "I got a notification that a complaint had been received involving my Westmere application. They don't tell you who filed it." A pause. "But obviously," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The apartment was very still. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn 2 blocks away, like a distant low drone. "Mira," she said, "I know how this looks." "Does it look like what it is?" I said. Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, exactly. More like the face of someone recalibrating. There were similarities between our proposals because we've been in proximity to your research for over a year. I've attended your seminars. I've heard you talk about your work at family dinners. Ideas, they move. You can't always trace exactly where You downloaded my draft application on October 16th, I said. You submitted your application on October 17th. She went still. "The cloud storage access log is in my documentation file," I said. "It's one of several items in the documentation file." The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which is a long time in a quiet apartment on a Saturday evening. I made a mistake," she said. I did not respond. I think there's a way to resolve this that doesn't become something that affects both of our careers. "I've already filed," I said. "The investigation is in process." "You can withdraw a complaint." "I could," I said. "I won't." She looked at me, and I saw something in her face then that I had not expected. Not the recalibration of someone caught in a tactical situation, but something underneath it that was older and stranger. A kind of recognition, or an attempt at one, like she was trying to remember if she had ever known who I was. I opened my front door. "You should talk to the Office of Research Integrity," I said. "They'll be contacting you." She left. I closed the door, stood in my living room for a moment, and then I went back to the paper I had been editing before she buzzed. The formal investigation ran from late May to October. That is longer than the standard timeline, but research misconduct investigations that involve submitted grant applications and multiple pieces of documentary evidence are inherently complex. And I had filed in a year when the ORI office was also managing 2 other active investigations in different departments. I knew, from reading the policy documentation carefully, that the investigative timeline was permitted to extend when evidence review was substantive. During that period, 3 things happened that I want to describe in some detail because each of them shaped the outcome. The first was the discovery of Felix. The investigators, there were 2 of them, drawn from a pool of faculty and administrators who were not in either of our departments, as required by conflict of interest policy, contacted me in June for a formal interview. This is standard. The complainant is interviewed under a process where their statements are recorded and can be referenced in the final report. I had prepared for this interview with the same approach I used for any data presentation. I had my documentation file. I had a clear narrative that moved from evidence to conclusion without jumping. I stated only what I could demonstrate. One of the investigators, a thin-faced woman named Verity Coldwater, who was a professor of chemistry and clearly had done this before, asked me during the interview whether I had any reason to believe the respondent had acted alone or had been assisted. Also, I had thought about this question before the interview. I had noted Felix's behavior, the avoiding of eye contact in the hallways, in my log. But I had no documentary evidence connecting him to the proposal rewrite. Stating a suspicion without evidence in a formal interview was not something I was willing to do. I have a note in my personal log about a behavioral observation, I said. I have no documentary evidence that supports a conclusion about involvement beyond the respondent. I'd prefer to limit my statement to what I can demonstrate. Verity Coldwater nodded once. The log entry? She said. Do you have it with you? I did. It was in my documentation file. She read it. She made a note. 3 weeks later, I learned through Gideon, who had by that point been formally interviewed as a supporting witness, and was cleared to share procedural information with me, that Felix had been identified as a material witness and had agreed to speak with the investigators. What Felix told them, I would only learn fully from the final investigation report. But Gideon told me enough in a brief conversation in his office in July. Felix had confirmed that he had been asked by Delphine to rewrite a grant proposal she had provided him. He had confirmed the timeline. He had confirmed that the source document was a completed application, not raw notes or preliminary ideas. He had been promised a letter of recommendation. He had also, apparently, been sufficiently troubled by the situation that he had kept in his own files, and a copy of the original document Delphine had given him to work from, which was my application. With my name on it, I sat in Gideon's office for a moment after he told me that. Outside his window, the courtyard was full summer now, the flowering plant replaced by something green and unremarkable. He kept it, I said, in a personal backup drive. Apparently he second-guessed the whole thing almost immediately, but didn't know what to do. I thought about Felix. Anxious, dissertation-stressed, caught between the pressure of needing a recommendation letter and the knowledge that he had done something wrong. I didn't feel warmth toward him, but I understood the shape of what had happened to him. Does he know that I flagged the behavioral observation? I said. Yes. Good, I said. And I meant it. He should know that the thing that brought him into the investigation was a small, specific detail that I had been attentive enough to notice. Not a judgment about his character, an observation. The kind of observation that research training makes you capable of. The second significant development was Delphine's response strategy. I found out about this through channels that were not entirely formal. One of the other postdocs in the building, a woman named Saffron who worked in a different lab and had no connection to the investigation, mentioned to me over coffee in September that she had heard from someone in the graduate office that Delphine was claiming the similarities in the proposals were the result of an ongoing exchange of research ideas between us, that we had developed the conceptual framework collaboratively over family conversations and departmental interactions, and that I was making a deliberate, vindictive claim in order to damage her over professional jealousy. I listened to this. I thanked Saffron for telling me. I went back to my lab. That evening, I went through my personal email archives and my text message history and my family dinner memory with a specific purpose. I was looking for any evidence that would support the counter-narrative, and more importantly, I was looking for anything I had that would contradict it. What I found was this. In the 18 months that Delphine had been at Thornfield, I had discussed my research in general terms at 3 family gatherings. I had attended 4 departmental seminars where she was present. I had exchanged 11 emails with her, none of which contained any substantive discussion of research methodology or intellectual framework. She had attended none of my research group meetings. She had never been to my lab. She had never been listed as a collaborator on any of my work. I compiled this into a supplementary document and submitted it to the investigation as additional evidence. The narrative she was building required a relationship of intellectual exchange that did not exist in the documentary record. Research ideas don't transfer through physical proximity. They transfer through meetings, emails, and shared documents, co-authored drafts. There was no paper trail of exchange because there had been no exchange. The structural analysis I had built, the 43 parallel elements, the 11 shared phrasings, became even more significant in this context. If she was arguing independent development, the investigators would have to believe that she had independently developed, down to specific turns of phrase, the same intellectual architecture I had spent 3 years building. And they would have to believe she had done it after only 18 months in a field adjacent to mine. Felix's copy of my application in her possession answered that question definitively, but the structural analysis was what made the investigation's conclusion possible without Felix's evidence had it not been available. That is important. I did not build the documentation file assuming that a lucky piece of corroborating evidence would appear. I built it to stand alone. The third development was Leander. I should say something about how Leander Ashford arrived in this story, because it is different from how these things usually work in stories. He did not rescue anything. He did not have information I needed. He did not accelerate the investigation or provide strategic help. He arrived the way most people who matter arrive, sideways during something else. He was a visiting researcher from another institution, there for a 6-month stint to use Thornfield's specialized sequencing equipment for a project on horizontal gene transfer in marine sediments. He showed up in the basement lab in August, which meant he appeared at the lab bench next to mine, only with a travel mug and a laptop sticker I couldn't quite read, and a way of working in silence that I found immediately comprehensible. We started talking over equipment, specifically over the centrifuge, which had developed an intermittent fault that required a specific rhythmic approach to its locking mechanism. You had to press and hold, and then release in a particular sequence. And he didn't know this, and I showed him. "How long have you been managing this?" he said. "About 8 months. Has no one reported it?" "I reported it in January. They ordered a part. The part is on back order." He looked at me with an expression that I categorized as sympathetic exasperation, the look of a person who recognizes institutional dysfunction and has decided, long since, to find it mildly funny. "Leander Ashford," he said. "Mira," I said. I know who you are. You're here for the horizontal gene transfer project. You read the visitor listings." "I read everything on the board." He smiled. It changed his face substantially. He was not conventionally handsome in the way of people who know they are handsome. He had the look of someone who thought a great deal and was occasionally surprised by what he thought. We started eating lunch together, then dinner occasionally, then spending evenings in the lab the way researchers do when they're in a productive cycle and don't want to stop. I told him about the investigation in September. Not everything, not the documentary details, but the shape of it. My sister, the grant, the evidence, the waiting. He listened in the way that good listeners do without offering solutions he wasn't asked for. "What will you do after?" he said. "After what?" "After the investigation closes, whatever the outcome, what comes next?" I had not spent much time thinking about after. I had been in the construction phase for so long that the thought of the investigation ending felt abstract. "Continue the work," I said. "There's a second grant cycle in the spring. I'll apply again." "With better cloud storage settings," he said. "With better cloud storage settings," I said. It was dry and quiet, and he had the decency not to push it further into something more significant than it was. I appreciated that. I was not ready for significance. I was in the middle of something. The investigation report came in October. I received it on a Tuesday. The email arrived in the late afternoon when I was in the middle of a data run, and I read it on my phone standing next to the centrifuge with the blue glow of the machine's indicator light making everything look slightly unreal. The report was 41 pages long. I read the executive summary standing there, and then I sat down on a lab stool and read the full findings. The investigators had concluded that the evidence supported a finding of research misconduct in the form of plagiarism. They had reviewed my original proposal and Delphine's submitted proposal. The full proposals, subpoenaed from the Westmere Foundation under the terms of the investigation, and conducted their own independent structural analysis, which had identified substantially similar elements consistent with copying rather than independent development. Felix's testimony and the copy of my proposal found in his possession had been noted as corroborating but not primary evidence. The investigators had been careful to frame the structural analysis as the primary evidentiary basis, which meant the finding did not rest on the credibility of a single witness. The recommended sanctions were as follows. Delphine was required to notify the Westmere Foundation of the finding and withdraw from the fellowship. The Westmere Foundation, upon notification, was required to pursue recovery of any funds already disbursed. Delphine was subject to a 3-year period of enhanced review for any future grant applications submitted through Thornfield University. A formal letter of finding was to be placed in her personnel file. I read the sanctions section twice. Then I read the part about my application. The investigators noted that my submitted proposal had demonstrated strong preliminary evidence and a well-constructed research design that was consistent with the evaluative standards of the Westmere Fellowship. They recommended that my application be forwarded to the Westmere Foundation for consideration in the current award cycle, noting the exceptional circumstances. I sat with that for a long moment. The centrifuge ran its cycle beside me and went quiet with a settling sound, like a long exhale. I sent a single-line email to Gideon. Report received. Finding in my favor. I'll come see you tomorrow. Then I put my phone face down on the bench and finished processing my afternoon data run, because the samples did not stop being valid data just because other things had happened. Thus, the Westmere Foundation received the investigation report the following week. I know this because I received a formal letter from their program officer, the same one who had sent me the rejection notice in February, informing me that my application had been reinstated for review and asking if I wished to confirm my continued interest. I replied that I did. I also, around this time, received a call from my mother. She had been told about the investigation by Delphine weeks earlier and had called me then. I had let it go to voicemail. She had called again after the report came out, and I had let that go to voicemail too. The third call I answered because I had made a calculation that allowing it to escalate would require more energy than having the conversation. My mother spoke for several minutes in a register that moved between upset and confused, and finally landed on a question she seemed to have been building toward. Why had I not come to her first? Told her privately, given Delphine the chance to make it right without the formal process. I let her finish. Because Delphine knew exactly what she was doing when she did it, I said. And because the formal process is what exists for exactly this situation. And because any resolution that happened privately would have required me to trust that a private agreement would be honored by someone who spent 8 months stealing my work. My mother was quiet. I'm not angry at you, I said. I know this is difficult, but I did the right thing and I did it correctly, and I need you to understand that. Another pause. She's saying she'll appeal the finding, my mother said. She can appeal, I said. The evidence is documented. We ended the call with the fragile, careful politeness of people who love each other and are not sure, in this particular moment, if they like each other. The appeal was filed in November. I received notification that an appeal committee had been constituted and would review the case. I had anticipated this. I had, actually, begun preparing for it in September when it became clear that the investigation would likely find against Delphine. An appeal is a review of the process, not a reinvestigation of the facts. The standard for overturning a finding is not we would have decided differently, but rather, the process was materially flawed. I had been a cooperative and procedurally correct complainant throughout. My documentation was time-stamped. My formal interview was recorded. Every piece of evidence had been submitted through proper channels. The appeal committee reviewed the case for 6 weeks and upheld the original finding in January. At that point, the Westmere Foundation initiated formal recovery proceedings for funds that had been disbursed to Delphine during the period between her award announcement and the investigation finding. She had received the first year's disbursement, $67,000, before the investigation concluded, and a partial second-year payment of approximately $33,000 that had been released before the foundation was formally notified. $100,000 disbursed. The remaining $100,000, which had not yet been paid out, was simply not released. Such that the recovery process for the $100,000 already paid was not instant. It involved the university's legal office and the foundation's recovery team. A period of negotiation about timeline, and eventually a formal repayment schedule that I was not privy to the details of. What I know is what eventually became, in some form, public record through the Foundation's annual disclosure report. Delphine repaid the disbursed funds in full over a structured schedule across the following year, $200,000, returned. I want to be precise about what this means and what it doesn't. It did not mean I received the money. The Westmere Fellowship was not transferred to me. My reinstated application was reviewed in the spring cycle and awarded then, as a new award in a new cycle, which meant the timeline shifted and the funding structure was somewhat different. I was awarded the fellowship in April. The funds came to my lab, to my research, to the work I had always been doing. That is what I wanted. I want to be clear about that too. I did not want revenge in the sense of watching someone suffer. I wanted my work returned to me. I wanted the institutional record to reflect what had actually happened. I wanted the mechanism that Delphine had used. The manipulation of proximity, the exploitation of access, the leveraging of institutional systems designed for legitimate use, to be named and documented and made visible. Documentation and evidence strategy, that was the domain, that was the mechanism. Not a dramatic confrontation, not an ally with power, a folder in cloud storage, methodically populated. I time-stamped from the beginning. I did not celebrate when the award came. I did not feel the particular dramatic swell of vindication that stories like this are supposed to contain. What I felt was more like the feeling of a long data run completing, the satisfaction of a process executed correctly, followed immediately by the next question. What was the next question? I had 3 years of fellowship funding. I had a clear research program. I had preliminary findings from 4 years of work that were, I believed, genuinely important. I had a lab bench next to a visiting researcher from another institution who had 3 months left on his stay at Thornfield, and who had the previous week asked me a question. The question was about whether I had ever thought about the marine sediment angle, whether my bacterial adaptation work might connect to his horizontal gene transfer findings in ways that neither of us had considered because we had been working in adjacent fields with our heads down. I had thought about this, actually. I had a set of observations in my data that I had been noting and not yet pursuing because the grant situation had occupied my attention. "Show me what you have," I said. We spent the better part of a Saturday in the lab going through both our data sets. The connection was real. Not immediately obvious, not ready for a paper, but real. The kind of signal in the data that means there is something there if you are patient enough to develop it. "This is at least a collaborative paper," he said. Maybe more." "It's more," I said. He looked at me. The lab was quiet. The centrifuge was still. The part had finally arrived in September and been installed, which had removed the intermittent fault and also, in some small way I found slightly sad, the reason we had first spoken. "I have 3 months left here," he said. "I know." "And then I go back to—" "I know where you're going back to," I said. "We can plan the collaboration around the geography." "You're very practical." "I've been practical all year," I said. "I find it suits me." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the data on the screen between us. Then, "For what it's worth, what you did this year, the way you documented it, the way you built the case. I've been in academia for 9 years, and I've seen 3 people in similar situations. None of them got their work back." "They should have," I said. "Yes," he said. "They should have." It was not a declaration. It was not a beginning, exactly. It was more like a recognition between 2 people who spend their lives trying to be rigorous about what they can and cannot claim. We could not claim certainty about where this was going. We could claim that the data, as it stood, was promising. That was enough to start. I heard from Delphine one more time. It was a letter, handwritten, delivered to my department mailbox in late February of the following year. It was 4 pages long. She described her regret. She described the pressures she had felt, the particular weight of operating in the professional shadow of an older sibling who had developed a reputation she could not match on her own timeline. She described Felix's role, which was not new information at that point. She described her understanding of what she had lost. Not the money, she wrote, but the possibility of a professional relationship with me that she now recognized she had never invested in properly. She asked if there was any version of a future in which we were sisters in anything more than name. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it, placed it in the documentation folder. This seemed right, the appropriate final entry, and I typed a single reply. "I don't know yet," I wrote. "Ask me again in a few years." I pressed send. Then I stood up, picked up my coffee, and walked down to the lab. The data was waiting. It was always waiting. That was, I had come to understand, what I loved most about it. Data does not care about any of this. It holds what it holds. And when it gives up what it gives up only to people willing to sit with it long enough to ask the right questions. I had 3 years of fellowship funding, a promising collaborative data set, a well-documented professional record, and a cloud storage system with very carefully managed permissions. I went back to work. The soil samples from the third collection site had been sitting in the refrigerator for 4 days, which was still within the analysis window. I pulled them out, labeled them, logged the time in the sample tracking sheet, and started the extraction process. The lab was quiet. The fluorescent light above my bench buzzed at its familiar subconscious frequency. The centrifuge, newly repaired, ran smooth and even. Outside somewhere, it was probably a very ordinary Tuesday. I had work to do.